conversation. You know, it's
I
just
know
downhill now.
it's already gone,
It's
and
already, we've missed it.
we've
Damn it.
missed
All
it.
right, we should stop.
It
Start again.
it's like
Some
the
other day.
it's the trouble when the B-roll is the best part of the show. But no, it's genuinely a pleasure to have you both, and I'm really I'm just honored that you would both take the time to do this with me. So thank you for being here. So
I'm honored to be here. I mean, with you both. I mean, that's fantastic. It's completely the other way around, Ben.
well, here we
I
go.
mean, it's an absolute pleasure.
So we've got Simon Wardley and Kat Swatell of the Wardley mapping community, and of course I'm Ben Mosier, and I run learnwardleymapping.com. Today we're going to talk about Map Camp. And hello everyone in chat, thank you for being here. If this is your first time, that's amazing. Thanks for showing up and being part of this with us. If you have questions or ideas about what we should talk about or things that we need to get through, like just feel free to type it in the chat. I'm watching that like a hawk. And if you've been here already and you're coming back, well, thank you. Like, this is great. I'm so glad that you would spend your time with us in this way. So today, Kat and Simon and I are going to talk a little bit about Map Camp, and then we'll probably talk a little bit about some like mapping community kind of things. But let's start with the basics. Map Camp is October 13th this year, in the year of 2021. And I think I was talking to Jane the other day. She said something like 55 early bird tickets left. So get them while they're hot. So Simon, I know probably many have heard the story at this point, but how did Map Camp all get started? Like, what is it all about? Let's start from the top. Let's make sure everybody has the same kind of knowledge here about how things got to where they are. So Map Camp.
How did it start? Gosh. So it started with a tweet. What you have to remember about me is that I often just walk along, despite the fact that I talk about situational awareness. I can be fairly oblivious to some things. I mean, so for example, I when I was running my own company, I discovered I didn't have a map. And I assume this is what you learned at MBAs and all the rest of it. So I hadn't got an MBA. So I created my own cheap and cheerful way of mapping. It took me about 6 months. And I used to show this to other people, sort of like, here's the cheap and cheerful Simon way of mapping if you haven't done an MBA. And then it took me about 6 years before I realized that other people weren't mapping and they weren't teaching this stuff at MBAs. And so it was like, how do you understand your landscape? And it's like, so it's like I put a tweet out and say, is anybody mapping in the space industry? And suddenly I get, Planet coming back, and I end up talking with Robbie about mapping and space. And I end up with people from NASA get in contact with me, tell me about what they're doing. I have no idea this stuff is spreading like this. So several years ago, I did a foolish thing. I just went, well, I'm not foolish, great fun. But I said, does anybody want to meet up in a pub or a cafe and do some mapping? Sort of thinking, there's not many of us. Maybe 4 or 5 people will turn up. And before I knew it, about 40, 50 people said, I'm coming along. And it was just like, oh, that's a bit big for a pub. So I managed to find a church. And so we got this church and said, right, anybody can come along. And so we had 180 people turn up to the church. We had a bunch of people agree to speak, and sort of like, okay, well, that was accidental. And then it was like, just after that, somebody said, well, you're going to do it next year. And I thought, okay, we better had. And so we just said, right, we're going to do this thing, and we've got a bigger hall. We're way too big now. But we had about 400 people turn up this time, and we had more speakers. And all of a sudden, it started turning into a conference. It wasn't planned to be a conference. Like the same way mapping was something I found useful. I wasn't expecting it to end up being used for running satellite programs in space. It was just something I found useful in my business, and I thought others might. And so before you knew it, 400 people, and then the next year we thought we'd get a bigger place. We can't fill that space, and so we get 800. And we got an entire tracks and all the rest of it. It's just like, it just seems to be doubling every year. And then we end up next year, it's 1,300. And I have no idea where we'll be this year. But it was, it was very much the accidental conference, which is sort of in tune with mapping, because mapping was a very accidental technique. I mean, people often say, "How did you invent it?" And I sat down with the great genius that I am and discovered. No, absolute rubbish. It was just a bunch of accidents, which ended up with this thing I found useful. And so exciting as it is, it was all an accident.
I love how you were almost like you were searching for something that should exist, and you could kind of see the hole. Like you could see all the things around the hole, and you were like, "Where's the tool that's supposed to be fitting right here?" And then you had to invent the pieces that go into it. And it's a fabulous kind of like story. And also, oftentimes I say that mapping provides us a couple different things, and like you've got the visualization kind of approach, the value chain, right? And then having that value chain described from left to right in some sort of spatial meaning. And then that meaning happens to be evolution, which you went off and researched and figured out, how things evolve and change over under the pressure of supply and demand competition. And then you did this other thing that kind of added into this whole mix, like as if that wasn't useful enough. You're like, okay, so we've got this, 5 factors Sun Tzu like kind of strategy thinking thing. We've got the strategy cycle, and I'm so excited to kind of see what kind of breakthroughs we make around how to help people engage in that strategic thinking process. But like, there's going to be so much time for us to explore that later. Map Camp is October 13th, and if you don't have your ticket yet, go to mapcamp.co.uk and get it, because there are only so many early bird tickets left. I think it's like 55. One of the things that sticks out to me, in particular from the first Map Camp, was how much beyond just it being an event where, hey, let's just get together and do some mapping, and then it got a little bit bigger than you expected. One of the things I noticed that you've been doing over the years, and you've done it for me and you've done it for others, is that you keep opening the doors to other people stepping into the space and contributing and sharing. And I know for a fact that I wouldn't have been able to go to Map Camp without your help that first year. And I came in and crash landed and took a nap in the crypt and all sorts of fun things. But like, I had a blast, and I met so many people. And I know that you keep doing this over like year over year over years. You keep opening doors, and one might say that Map Camp is not just yours anymore. It's something that's shared with others. And so I'd like to turn to Kat a little bit here today and think, Kat, like from your standpoint, from what you've seen over the years and the way things have changed, is this just Simon's, or is there more like of a different like different perspectives contributing to this? What is Map Camp accomplishing now that we've had a couple years under our belts from your perspective?
Yeah, I think I love Simon dearly, but mapping is not Simon's now, and it hasn't been, I would say, for a while. And that's what's so special about it, right? Like, I think a lot of people know how I feel about mapping, that it does destroy some of those barriers or disassemble them, right, that are constructed by the crew, the MBA crew in their tailored blue suits. And I mean, if you want to get an MBA, you should definitely go get one, but you should also appreciate that there is a lot of knowledge that lives in the epistemic margins of organizations. And when you have a technique like mapping that is accessible to anyone, right, Ben, it takes very little time to get started. Yep. Basically anyone can read a map and start to give feedback essentially immediately.
Yep.
So it is a great way to tap that knowledge that we have all these barriers constructed around it, almost like we don't want it. Well, now things are changing so quickly. We need that, right? And so techniques like this and communities like this that are welcoming and that are really interested in building sensitivity around that knowledge, that's so important in my opinion,
Yeah.
and the joke that I always love to make when I'm like doing a talk about mapping or a workshop or something, I'll say, well, Simon's probably going to appear behind me and strike me down. And when I say this or that, and people always laugh, right? They have that reaction. And that's kind of like my temperature read on the community. If people are laughing at that statement, then that's a good thing, right? Because that the whole idea of that is ridiculous. And that's exactly the way that we want it, right?
Yeah,
That's my
and yet we've
opinion.
seen the opposite in other communities of practice. Not mapping, but like other kinds of techniques. Like it's especially the techniques that are centered on a like an individual, like a person who invented a thing, and then went off and like basically just used that as, it's all about me, and for better or for worse, I'm the one who knows everything about it. And what ends up happening there is, yeah, exactly that situation where like someone might strike me down, literally, like come in and like do some angry tweeting or what have you. So yeah, I think that, this is like, as an epistemic tool, worthy mapping has a lot to do with knowledge and with the fact that knowledge is a powerful thing, and that knowing things that other people don't know is is itself a powerful thing. And when you start to look at the kind of shape of institutional knowledge, like the MBA style of things, there are a lot of margins, because like the institutional knowledge is like this much and the world is like this much. So by being able to like have a tool that we can use to chip away at those margins, and not only just chip away at them, but have them be chipped away at by people who do not have formal institutional power, is like a really interesting dynamic. Which is why, like, Simon, you've written the book, and it seems like you're writing it for the executives who are secretly feeling like they're imposters. And I've definitely seen this play out where like you have like a director level or above, or an executive just like, I'm not really sure how I'm supposed to be making decisions. People keep coming to me and asking me to make the decisions about things. What ends up happening, I think, that's even more interesting, is what happens when individuals who don't necessarily possess formal power pick up the technique and start constructing their own informal power as a result. And when those individuals start talking with other individuals who also don't possess formal power, suddenly you start to have, and Kat, maybe you can fill us in a little bit about on this, because I'm still getting my head wrapped around the concept. But like, you start to create this interesting dynamic where there's a tension between power over people, like authority, and oftentimes authority that isn't really fully informed, versus power with. And I think power with pairs well with power to. It's like cheese and wine or something. Kat, could you like just help me with the definitions there a little bit, so that I can set Simon up for like an interesting exploration here?
Yes. So in most organizations that we see today, and especially in the West, they're organized around power over, right? So you gain power by having power over other people, over products, over. So that's an extractive form of power. We get power by extracting it from other people, from our literal physical environment, right? But now we're shifting into this digital era, right? Where that extractive mode is not always as relevant, right? Because there's not the same scarcity on digital goods, right? So now what I'm seeing is that more and more we have methods, and there's not the same like default tendency all the time to power over. And what I'm seeing is people are starting to tap into power with and power to a lot more. So power with is the power that we have with other people, right? This is like collective action and things like that. And then power to is the power when we're oriented towards achieving an outcome rather than extracting things. Does that make sense? So that's really awesome because you can fully exploit the opportunities that we're prevented or that we are presented in a digital space, right? Where scarcity is not an inherent quality of the space that we're constructing. However, power over does not want the pie to grow, right? Power over just wants to get more of the existing pie, whereas power with is like, let's grow the pie. Power to is like, let's have all different sorts of pie. What sorts of pie could we invent, right? And so, like, there's definitely power with and power to can kind of hang out together and be good to go. But power over is directly at odds with either of those. So it does certainly create some tension when you have folks who have accumulated power based on this one paradigm. And then you have this brand new space starting to open up. You have new methods like Wardley mapping, like ensemble programming, all of these things that are oriented towards power with and power to. So there's certainly tension.
Excellent. So that's the perfect lead in. And Simon, what I want to do maybe is a little bit of mapping, as I was kind of sharing with you earlier. Like, who knew mapping on a on a live stream with Simon? Part like the singular purpose of doing these live streams for me is making sure that we have more examples of maps and more examples of mapping, like in motion, so that folks can look at this stuff and go, hey, that looks like the problem that looks like a problem that's relevant to me. I get how this works now. I can see myself doing this. So what I was thinking we could do is jump into a Miro board and talk a little bit about Map Camp and kind of like string together a little bit of a thread here about what does Map Camp enable? Because I think there's this idea that when you map together, you can share a common definition of a problem space or a mess, and that enables you to do more of this power with kind of thing. I don't know, how does that sound to you?
It sounds great. It sounds wonderful. I've not tried this before. Sounds good. Just a couple of things before we do dive in, though. In defense of MBAs, I've got to say, I'm delighted that mapping is being taught at Peking University, Moscow Institute of Technology, Harvard Kennedy, LSE. So it's started to spread, okay, which is great to hear. In terms of power over the community, well, obviously I called it Wardley mapping because I wanted to retain control. Now, actually, I called it Wardley mapping because somebody asked me, what's it called? And I went, I don't know. Wardley mapping, and that was it. It was just an accident. But I spent an awful lot of time trying to make sure that others. I'm a terrible leader, and the best way of I know of leading is to get other people to lead for you. So this is what I constantly try and do. I know that Map Camp UK currently has my picture, and Jane has promised me is going to replace my picture with the picture of the entire community and say the community presents. I will be so happy when that happens, because I'd like to hide away in the. I'm people talk about leadership, powerful, charismatic individuals. Just done a survey on this. Well, first of all, I'm not powerful and charismatic. I like to hide away. I'm a hermit. So I much prefer the distributive form where other people do all the hard stuff. In terms of the book as well, there's a reason why it's I haven't published it into a proper book. It's online. It's all Creative Commons. It's also unfinished. And there's a reason for that, is I'm hoping someone else will eventually finish it for me, at least tidy it up, write the other chapters that I could have written but I never got round to, and all the rest of it. So please, somebody help themselves to it and turn it into the book that I always wanted to write but was never capable of doing. That would make me so, and I could just buy a copy and read it and go, God, I wish I'd written that. That would make me so happy. All right, so now I'm all yours.
No, I love that. That's right on. Yeah, and you can, man, I want to write. We've got to write so many books, and it's like the thing is, it's not even just Ben books and Simon books and Cat books. It's like there are people who are watching this right now who have like really interesting ideas about mapping and applying mapping to a particular space or idea. And it's like those people need to write books. And if you want help writing books, let me know. I'd be happy to help you write books.
I have 13 books on my shelf, which have mapping in them.
Ah, yes.
At least 13 different books, which is like fantastic. Um, the only book that's not on my shelf is the one that I've written. And my intention is to keep that state and to grow the number of books that other people have written, because all I really want to do is open a door and let people walk in and discover. This is also why it can be a little bit frustrating sometimes. People say, well, are you going to finish that bit off? And I could do, but sometimes I go, no, I want others. Does that make sense?
Well, it creates space,
Terrible,
right?
bad. All my secrets are coming out.
No, it. I think it's really an important way of doing things, right? Because it's not mine. Go away. Just let me do it,
No.
right? It's an invitation. It's like this is here. Like it's unfinished, and you can come and contribute to it. And in a lot of ways, like when it comes to making maps, I think that's a similar attitude that we can bring to it as well. It's like, hey, here's an unfinished definition of a mess. Can you help us make sure that we are looking at this and seeing all the right things? Because then we're going to have a conversation about what to do. And I think like that invitation, like this is unfinished, come help us figure out how to do it, is a very kind of powerful way to help people feel like they can contribute. And
Well, there's also a bit of accident. Most of my life is accident anyway. In
happy
here,
little accidents.
it's so. There's a game called World of Warcraft, which I used
Yeah.
to play. I used to build online, a fairly large online guild. The maximum size was about 1,000 people. My guild was getting close to that. And one of the lessons I learned was actually the single most important thing of any collective is not the person who people think created the collective or think is running the collective. It's the people that come after and join, because they're the people who actually create an environment where others can join. So the single most important thing you can do is, if you've got something you're passionate about, is share it with others and allow others to use it, and welcome them and help them as much as possible, and put yourself, realize that you are not you are not the most important thing. They are. And so you have to put yourself secondary to those. And I learned that playing, bizarrely enough, World of Warcraft. I used to do that a long time ago. But this is why I keep on telling people you should play with things like World of Warcraft, EVE Online, because there's all sorts of organizational management lessons within those games, and they're real, they're scenarios that you can play. It's gameplay. It's a good way of learning about this stuff. And I know there are courses out there where they now teach executives basics of motivation and situational awareness in World of Warcraft. And you're discovering World of Warcraft, of course, that maps are important. So anyway,
I was just
I'm
thinking
chin wagging. Sorry, terrible.
no,
Let's
no.
get onto the map. Sorry.
Well, I was just thinking of Andy Nordgren and the work that she did
yeah.
related with EVE Online, and I'm just thinking, like, why does that work the way that it works? Well, like, because you can't lean on the formal, like the traditional
Pay your money
structures of power. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. And thinking of people who are just sharing things that they're excited to share with others. I'm like Tristan Slominski is in the chat right now, and like he's working on something that he's playing with called Mapkeep, and like he's got a Substack and he's like sharing it openly. He's like, come join me, play with this thing. And it's like, it's that kind of dynamic that the more we can do that, and the more we can do that together, I think that's where the exciting stuff is. So I have this weird idea, and so I'm in the Miro board, and I think I'm gonna just grab the map template and pull it up here so we can just play with a big map. I'm gonna lock it down. So I have this weird idea that map camp. Here's the hypothesis: like maps are tricky, right? Because you don't know what to map until you've like done mapping a bit, and you kind of can start to have that sensitization to be like, oh right, I need to figure out this problem, and I think the best way to do that is to map the mess that it's in. You can't know what to map until you've made a map at least once or twice, but like once you start getting that down, you can almost start a map from anywhere, right? And so one of the places that I'm thinking about starting a map is, well, Map Camp. because it's coming up on October 13th. Get your tickets at mapcamp.co.uk. Mapcamp, in a certain sense, has a bunch of things in it. It has a bunch of activities, like there's organization, there's speaking, there's all sorts of stuff. And if I just like oversimplify and kind of like blur, like zoom out and blur the picture a little bit, and I say, okay, here's Mapcamp. What is the role in a hypothetical map? Like, what is the system around Mapcamp that Mapcamp is a part of? Is, I think, the interesting question. And then what that leads us to is, what does Mapcamp enable? So from a value chain perspective, what could potentially depend on Mapcamp, or the things that are going on inside Mapcamp, and what already depends on Mapcamp? And so I'll throw something out there just to put like a kind of like a first straw man out here, so you all can, you know, smack it with shovels or whatever. And so I'm gonna say Mapcamp is a form of conference, and I'm going to put conferences in probably like, I don't know, mid-product. I'm not overthinking this very hard. And because it's an online conference in particular, there's an interesting output for us that is implied, which is content, video content. And video content depends on this online conference called Mapcamp. So that's one thing that I think Mapcamp potentially enables. But before I get too far ahead of myself there, okay, as far as a system, what's missing? And do you agree with this? Where they're placed, how the parts are scoped? Like, what are your first reactions to this? Who wants to go
There
first?
we are. Well, okay. So from my perspective, first of all, there isn't a wrong or right way of mapping. I mean, maps tend to stabilize down to something that everybody in the group finds useful.
Yep.
It takes a little bit of time to do this, but I tend to go quite strongly from the perspective of, users.
Yeah.
So I would start from the point of view, okay, there's two. If I grab this, sorry,
Yeah.
I'm just going to put some other boxes in there.
By all means.
We're going to have two users in here. I would go attendees.
Yep.
And I will start with organizers, okay? And we're going to eventually change this because we'll get to the purpose of something like mapping. This is all on the fly. So we'll put attendees public over here, organize here, and we'll go, what do attendees want to go? Yeah, they want to go to an event. They need an event. Well, why do they need an event? Well, they want to learn something, which is useful.
Yep.
So they want to learn, but of course that needs it. Is it of interest? If in a corporate world, so we're now going to make them corporate attendees. We'll go concept of it being useful. They don't have to be corporate attendees, attendees in competition or something along those lines.
Got
useful. An event. Now, event itself requires a physical space, so we'll put this down here.
Yep.
And what's happened is that physical space has evolved under pressure from COVID to being online. So, this is where I'll throw out. Do you mind if I move this off over here? Because, what I'm doing is I'm going to put links here. Links. Oops. Oh, I'm not very good with this.
It's perfectly fine. There's a little trick with this too in Miro, where if you click on the line, you can change it to be a straight connection instead of a wibbly wobbly one.
Right.
So I'll do that real quick. Let's see.
Okay. So I'm basically saying that's going to be an arrow down there. Go on, click the button. Oh, finally. So this is evolve physical to online, driven by, we better put the isolation economy, which is caused by COVID. So we can have COVID as an actor in here. I have no idea where this is going to go. Oops. Kat, by the way, start just diving in and telling me where I'm getting everything wrong. COVID. So isolation economy is a forcing function. Oops. Oh.
I was doing some things. Let me know if I messed you up here.
No. It's a forcing function for that. Online. Okay. Event, physical, online. And that needs, I don't know if this is useful yet at all. And that needs video content. We did video content for physical events. It often was an afterthought, though. I know that from our own map camps and everything else. So people want to go to learn. Oops. They want to go learn, hopefully, at an event. Or sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just go to an event because it's the social network thing to do.
I was thinking about that as well, yeah.
So we've got to put the network in there as well. Now we come to the question of how much is actually to learn, how much is to network. So let's put these like this.
Is there anything else that people do, in particular with and this is tough because we're trying to deal with multiple like time considerations. Like one is like, how were things before with physical events? How are things now with online events? And it's like we can try to like pull the things that we did in the physical space into the online space, but I feel like there's also like some things don't come along, and also there are other things that we don't know we can do yet with online events. So like, is it just learning? Is it just networking? Like what else is there that people do with online events?
So there's collaboration, there's social interaction, there's learning, there's all the elements of inclusion, which we've done in physical events or attempted to do in physical events, which have to be translated to this online world. So if we go physical and we change this and we go virtual, then what we've got above this is a really good point, Ben, is what you've actually got are physical practices, which were very well established, understood, and everything else for for things like collaboration, learning, and everything else. And then you've got virtual practices, which are less well understood.
Yeah.
So part of the inertia that we have to the change of, going to using virtual events has always been, well, how do we network with others, socialize with others, all that sort of stuff as well. So you've got that sort of problem, is that we're learning about those virtual practices. Network requiring, this will change from this set of practices to that set of practices. In fact, learning will change from this to this. And in fact, what we can do is we can add collaboration up there as well. So we'll have to tidy this up a little bit. You've got collaboration, learning, networking tied to physical practices. Actually, I suppose we can get rid of the concept of event here.
That's fine with me.
And make this more generic. So what we've got is networking tied to physical practice, learning tied to physical practices, and collaboration tied to physical practices. And then now what we're doing is we're also tying those to virtual practices. Now, because we get good at how we used to do in physical practice, how we used to run events and everything else, that all creates inertia to this change, despite the fact the isolation economy is forcing us along that line.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something else now that mixes in with this, which is if you go corporate attendees, well, there's another side, depending upon who the corporate attendee is, which is status. So what, there is part of the problem, particularly as you got the more executive end, is issues of status and power become power over, as Kat was saying earlier, become really important. But that's also supported by symbols like, top floor office, the fancy office,
Yep.
the fancy furniture, and all the rest of it. And so we've got pretty good at defining status in terms of physical practices. We know what that means. You've got a flash office, it's the top floor. You've got a chauffeur. You've got your own, restaurant in the corporate area, your own bathroom, blah de blah.
Yep.
But do we have? But we don't really have those status symbols. I mean, people have tried to recreate it. My home video studio is really flash. It's been designed. Yeah. I've got a designed avatar. Here, have some NFTs. I own this image. I mean, people are trying to recreate status in those sort of virtual world. But it's difficult, and people have already got that pre-existing status in that physical world, which is why you got a lot of executives running around saying, despite the fact that performance has gone up and everything else in the office place, remotely working, that we've got to get back into the office. It's got nothing to do with effectively collaborating, learning, and networking. It seems to have everything to do with status.
Yeah.
So does that help us with Map Camp at all, or have we just thrown us completely left field?
I think it does, because what I'm noticing too right now is that by focusing on corporate attendees, we're actually almost preventing ourselves from being able to see some of the margins in a way. Like and like what we've done is we've kind of like said, okay, there's an existing value chain that this kind of segment of users needs, and this is the way it works for them. And yes, there are things like status, and yes, there's like networking, and there's the need to use up the training budget, things like that.
Yeah.
But so Kat, I suspect you might have some good rants like stored up around this, but I'm thinking like my interest in mapping is, and honestly, my interest in doing Map Camp is not at all about corporate attendees. It's entirely about individuals for whom there's kind of like a power gap or an epistemic gap. And so what I'm interested in thinking about is, how can you, for example, use the existing structure and like enabled like system of supporting corporate attendees and exapt it, repurpose it, and maybe make a few tiny design tweaks to support other community actors who may like be able to reuse those parts for different purposes. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that whole little spiel.
I think what Simon just did by adding community is exactly where my mind first went, right? Like there is a reason why we removed event from this, because corporate attendees don't actually need an event. They don't, right? Like we just illustrated that. However, our community, and I don't even think it's individual actors within our community, Ben, let's make it spicy, disagree.
Okay, all right.
I don't think those individuals need an event either. The community needs an event, right? To establish new connections within the community, to reinforce certain connections, to emphasize that we don't care about Simon anymore, all of those things. We need an event, right? We, the community, not really any one of us individually. Yes, does that, and if we come together and we create this event, which is a space that is oriented around power with and power to, and we literally create that space, which is the event, then what you were saying, Ben, all of those individuals who are marginalized in whatever different way, we give them a space where they can bring whatever they'd like. So I think it serves us best to focus on the community and the need there. And then I think there are all sorts of interesting things that I personally have observed around growing a community and making a community accessible that have to do with virtual practices, right? And Ben, you and I talked about this the other day, right? That like the online Wardley mapping tool and the VS Code plugin, those actually make mapping more accessible in a lot of ways to the visually impaired members of our community, right? Because then we have a visual language that you don't need to see a map with sticky notes and all of these things, right? Because we have it essentially in code right
Yep.
there. So I think as we go virtual, it's a great opportunity for us to reach out, and maintaining a virtual practice, a virtual event, even when the pressure of COVID is easing, I think is a great way to maintain an attitude of accessibility within our community.
I like that angle on this a lot because okay, so spicy or not, focusing on the community as like I tend to have this bias right for individuals because and that's because I like working with individual people. When they become part of an organization, then it's just like ugh. I don't want to think about that too much because I have thoughts about organizations. But what you're saying about focusing on the community reminds me a lot of the some of the work that we've done around like focusing on Donna Haraway and thinking about the ways that we're already entangled in society in group kind of affiliations and associations in ways that often we aren't willing to recognize. And so like the map is doing its job right now. Like it's setting the stage and giving us the props we need in order to talk about the things that we care about. And so like this is great because then that leads me to like a me versus we problem or a me versus we framing. And it's not even it's not even just me versus we. It's me and me and me and me, all the different individual me's, different than we. Because the me's interacting together produce a whole, and it's like parts and wholes all over again. So now I'm thinking like from the standpoint of how to refine a design, because I think mapping is often about like trying to understand what the current design is, whether or not that was designed intentionally, but then also to think about how the design could be. And so now we have like two different kinds of ways of refining this. Does this work for individuals? And does this work for collectives? So that I feel like Simon, I should tee you up here to go on a me versus we rant, perhaps.
No, 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 no. This is great. I'm listening, because one of the things I like to do, I love online Wardley maps, by the way. So often in conversations when people are talking, I'm actually on online Wardley maps and just coding out the map as they go. And then halfway through the conversation, I'll go, I think I've got a map. And then then I'll turn into scribbling on the map and everything else because I think it's great. I mean, lots of frustrations like with any other tool, but I mean, it gets me a long, long way. And I think it's a fantastic effort and wonderful thing that provided from the community. So one of the things about when we talk about collectives, so we start with the whole, I did that culture mapping stuff quite some time ago. And if you start from the principle of the individual, the choice, as Kat likes to say, the ethics of choice versus the ethics of care. So you've got, it's all about the transaction. It's all about the choice. It's all about the individuality, which is usually about power over others. Perfect. Right, so that's that power relationship, as in power over others. When we talk about collectives, it's often about control, the collective control of an environment. So not so much agency, but control. So power with others is a wonderful way of saying this. And a lot of this stuff, the collective, what defines that collective are things like the values, the behaviors. I mean, there's general concepts like principles or doctrine, as I like to say, but really it is the core thing which cements it in terms of gives that sense of belonging and makes you feel this is a collective that is succeeding if its values are spreading and, it governs its behavior are those values or beliefs. So that's why I stuck principles and values. I'm just going to take principles out because that's really doctrine and just leave it as values. So that's the key thing. Now, I might have been deliberately inserting values into MapCamp. If you may not have noticed this over time, and this year's MapCamp has three very, very, shall we say, strong tracks and three absolutely truly wonderful chairs in Damien, Jen and Kat as well, so fantastic. But we've got three strong tracks within MapCamp. One on the idea of sustainability, which leads us all down the line of the green economy and everything else, and a fundamental belief that it's a good idea. Harvesting is okay as long as you don't deplete the resource and the environment and destroy the environment in the process. So it's all about having balance with society, with the environment. The next one is society, and so that really is all about the balance of the me versus we. The whole sort of tendency of one size fits all, that sort of thing, is not good, and actually creates very unstable and weak systems. And that's why we've got the third track, which is about resilience. And resilience is ultimately, it goes back to, I don't mean this in terms of anti-fragile, don't get me started. In terms of C.S. Hollings is what I'm thinking about. So C.S. Hollings talks about engineering and ecological resilience. And in order to create a resilient system, you have to have diversity within that system, which means you have to have things like inclusion of others, etc., within a system. Otherwise, it would never, ever be resilient. So I am inserting deliberately particular values into this. And I suppose the critical thing is whether the community coalesces and agrees with those values. Or, as I said, I'm not leading this anymore. It'll be overtaken by the community. It may come up with a whole bunch of other values instead. But I think the beliefs of the community, what it values, are the things that we need to basically support or enshrine. And we're even talking about creating some sort of foundation to support those beliefs and values. By the way, I will, if we do this, I'll have to invite you both to be founding, or as I would call them, ancients of Mumu, being a KLF fan. So trustees of any foundation. But I think that's the next sort of step. So going back to your map there, what I've done is collective value. So it's not really about status. It's not really about power over others. Yes, it maps useful in terms of competitive games with others and that sort of thing. But when we talk about MapCamp, it really is, as Kat said, it's about coalescing the community. And that requires us to define what those values really are. And I know I've been inserting some in there. That's but that's how I am.
And the whole format of MapCamp last year and this year is that we are going to have open discussion of those values and some of the trade-offs that we're making, right? And each of the sessions is a little triad where people have different points of view on the theme, and we're going to map and we're going to have discussions, like explicit discussions about what it means to practice these values and what trade-offs we have to make.
Yeah, I want to represent that on the map because that seems like a constraint on the development of values and the negotiation of those values. Because like to the extent that the values are just like Simon's, like imagine like Simon has a little book and he's like this in this book is my values and this is the tome and you will follow the tome and that's how it works. Then the problem is as soon as like Simon, his attention gets put somewhere else, right? For like 5 minutes and the community does what it does and like, well, the extent to which we can interpret the tome is the extent to which we can reproduce those values. And whereas if the values themselves are coming from, but also like already within the people in the community and so on, like that becomes a much more interesting and resilient, like sort of decentralized, I'm thinking like starfish versus spider kind of ideas here. Like this, if open is like a, have a bias towards open as the principle, but in general, like that supports certain kinds of values around like not like we don't exclude people. We don't like push them out. Like we welcome them and things like that. We welcome them to contribute. We create space for them. Like creating space for others is one of the values that I at least feel is like super important to the mapping space. And so how do you make that like a thing, right? How does it like get out of Simon's head and become a thing? Well, it has, you have to talk about it, right? Like, you have to be like, it's there. What? So Simon, I see you changing some things. Tell us about what you're thinking about now.
Oh, well, this is fantastic because I totally agree with both of you here. Is The point is, I have a particular set of values and beliefs and other bits and pieces, and so obviously, I'm set out with mapping with the idea of openness and sharing and everything else, and underneath this is a concept known as challenge, because I love the idea of challenge, and maps are fantastic vehicles, I find, for having that discussion. Whereas most of our society is story led, and unfortunately, we have an entire industry which runs around telling people that to be a great leader, you've got to be a great storyteller. And the problem with that means that when you tell me a story, if I challenge the story, I'm actually saying you're not a great leader. I'm attacking you if I challenge the story. Because if the story fails, it's obviously because you weren't a great leader, which is totally the wrong way of doing things, because it means every story becomes highly political. One of the beauties I like about maps is you get the assumptions on a map, and I say, I don't say that you're wrong. I say I disagree with the map. I'm taking it away from you. And on top of that, you're exposing your assumptions. And so one of the things I like about maps is that we can challenge each other's assumptions in a fairly non-threatening, non-destructive way if we have a communication mechanism like maps. Now, obviously, that has some negative side, is if your power is all basically wrapped up with your brilliance at being a storyteller, i.e., top floor office, you're 6'3", big blonde hair, blah blah blah, nice good teeth, well groomed, fantastic orator, and all your power is wrapped up in that sort of idea. You generally don't like the idea of people challenging you anyway. You normally, when you say challenge, you mean I'm going to tell you what to do, and then I'll challenge you afterwards if you haven't done it. That's what you mean by challenge, not a two-way street. So I like this idea of challenge that comes with maps, and I suppose we've got to use that to have a discussion about the values that actually should exist within this collective that we're calling mapping.
There's something that I think I've gotten Jabe to rant about this, I think, once or twice. So Jabe Bloom talks about the correspondence versus coherence theories of truth. And so the trick is, like, we're not trying to necessarily, or at least I'm not trying to, I won't speak for you, Simon. I think stories are really useful and like really helpful in a certain way. Different stories can be told as a result of making a map. But I think it has to do something with this like difference between correspondence and coherence theories of truth. And coherence is just like, does the narrative make sense? Whereas correspondence has to do with, does it match reality? Like, does it actually, like, what? Is it real? Is it true or roughly true? And so like part of what I've heard Jabe say before is that you're trying to like manage both. Like you in order for people to feel like they're part of something, they need to see the story and fit themselves within a narrative. But if the narrative is completely off base and the narrative is completely lost, and it's just the sort of fictitious imaginings of one person's head, then yes, you're gonna have a problem, because you're gonna fit within the story, and it's gonna make sense and also get you hurt in some ways that you maybe not are not expecting. And so challenge, I think, one thing that it presents the opportunity for is moments when you notice that, hey, that narrative doesn't match what I'm seeing. Like, it's not part of what the reality, like the instruments are saying that's not true. So what, like, the data doesn't tell us that story. So how do we reconcile those conflicting perspectives? But then also, I think, like, the narratives that can be told, or that can become dominant narratives, also, like, if you can challenge the dominant narratives and present alternatives, well, then you can have like I don't know if I'm using pluriversal correctly, but this like comes back to me versus we. The problem with rule by a particular me is that it excludes all the other me's, right? Like if we just focus on corporate attendees in this map, right, then we privilege those perspectives over other perspectives. What other me's might be out there that might find useful the kinds of concepts that we talk about in Map Camp? And so just like threading this all together, if we're sitting here telling ourselves a story about how we're the best corporate attendees and we're all going to like make sure that we're dealing with that status problem and replacing it with something else, and meanwhile we're missing this other narrative, then I think that's a problem. And by exposing what we're doing to the community, then they can also say, not only is that not my narrative, but that's not the way reality looks from here at all. So challenge the fact that we have a component that is challenge based on maps, that we can make artifacts, that we can share artifacts, we can talk about those artifacts, challenge each other on how those artifacts look, how they ought to look, all that kind of fun stuff, enables us, I think, to have those conversations. So,
which is what we're doing. Exactly with this. So this goes back to Derrida deconstruction theory. There is no truth to text. To words. It's or the meaning comes from the context which it's used. And what we're doing here is we're exposing the underlying context, the assumptions that we have. Now, one of the problems we have is in the corporate world is, this goes back to your point you raised about what happens when reality disagrees. Mm-hmm. So one of the problems we have in the corporate world is known as Ashby's law of requisite variety. So the controlling, just to keep it simple, the controlling system has to have as much complexity as the inputs and outputs of what's being controlled. And there are two solutions to that. You either make the management capable of coping with the complexity of reality, or you pretend reality is simple. And so your management can be simple. And we do this with things like KPIs and 2x2s. That's why we love them so much. It's not that they represent reality, they create an illusion of simplicity on reality, which is why we have that phrase, keep it simple, stupid, which really translates to keep it simple, I'm stupid. And I don't want to think about this stuff. Give it to me in a 2x2. I know it's not real. I know it's an illusion, but at least in a 2x2, I can go, we can be in that corner or that corner or something along those lines. So the problem we have when reality pokes its ugly head and says, your 2x2 is wrong, we have a tendency of not actually wanting to embrace with reality, but to believe there must be some other magical 2x2. If only we had another axis or another way of looking at it, and all the rest of it as well. I like this because even this mapping form, and we're going into a weird and wonderful discussion. Sorry, my fault. Probably not.
Excellent.
My fault.
I'm excited to have Ashby's Law on the books. Like we're.
but I love this because it allows for this form of discussion. At this point, I need to let her shut up.
I loved that rant. And Kat, I want to dig into like bounded cognition and just like we only have so much time to make decisions. We only have so much ability to absorb the information, and so like it's I think even more messy than a simple like oversimplify or control to the fullest extent. Like there's a lot more like other things that are in there, I think. Kat, I want to give you the chance to react to that, and then I think we should maybe close out a little bit and do our call to action. Map Camp! Let's go to Map Camp. Everyone go to Map Camp. mapcamp.co.uk. So Kat, what reactions do you have hearing our yammerings about theories of truth, values? What's missing for you?
Of course, I love being disagreeable, so I'll find some ways in which I can disagree. I don't think that people are stupid, right? I think, if I told you the story this way, Ben, I've been doing something for my whole career, and it's gotten me to this awesome place. And now I'm just going to stop doing it. Like, you would be like, Kat, are you okay? Do you need to see
You
a
sure?
doctor, or what's happening here? Right. But that is what we're saying,
Yeah.
right? We're like, you have been practicing these things, you have gotten by exploiting your unearned privilege, or whatever the case may be. You've been doing 2x2 matrices forever, and it's gotten you all of these great places personally, and your company is doing well. Of course, like, that would not sound smart to go to be like, oh, I'm doing something different, right? So I think what we need to offer both to our community and to the world at large is to say, yes, we appreciate all the success that those things have brought you. And now we're entering into a radically different time. We have this completely different way that we're going about life, all of us across the planet. And now let's look at, how do we sensitize ourselves to those opportunities? How do we exploit them, right? And so we can appreciate that those ways have served you super well. And then we can offer up some new things that will serve you well going forward, right? And hopefully serve all of us a little bit better.
Yeah.
But
I'm really
yeah.
glad you said that, because that really, I think, frames it in a way that doesn't devalue what people like, their literal lived experience is that this thing has worked for them up until this point.
Mm-hmm.
And in a certain way, at least they defaulted to the right end of the false dichotomy, the one that allowed them to take action instead of the one that caused them to sort of sit there and were forever trying to figure out what the right move is, because they have to control all the parts, right? So I think that's an important thing to do. And look, it's like chemistry, and I was terrible at chemistry, just to be very clear. But I remember them teaching us the wrong thing first, the simpler thing first, so that in a couple years we could pick up the more complex, messy thing. And so, I mean, yeah, if you have bad heuristics or questionable heuristics, like, okay, and now we're going to make things a little bit more interesting and show you something a little bit more messy. So I like
Yeah,
this.
make the world bigger,
Yep,
right?
yep.
Instead of being like, you now in digital space can programmatically enact what existed for you in the old space. We could say, there's all these new possibilities.
Yeah,
Jump on it.
come on. Come along.
Well, I love that. So I am voting for Kat to be president of the Wardley mapping everything.
I thought you were going to say the world, because at this point,
Oh, well, yeah, the
yeah,
world as well. That would be useful. But
Cat
I
for
don't have a
Prez.
vote on the world, but definitely Cat for Prez. I
Yeah.
mean, I got Jane is going to change the mapcamp.co.uk, so it's the community presents, because it is an open community. I'm now going to argue we should have it as Cat. We should, but there we are.
President-elect Cat.
But it's fantastic. One of the things I love most about the community is the willingness to challenge, the willingness to disagree, to discuss. I mean, I did my culture mapping stuff. I had in the UK we have this big thing about leaving the European Union, not leaving Brexit, Remain, and I managed to get two groups of absolutely ardent supporters who would not see eye to eye with each other to discuss the entire situation in fairly civil terms using a map, because now everybody's not fighting each other in their personal stories, but they're discussing the map. And so I love these sorts of discussions. I love being told that people aren't stupid. Well, I agree, they're not. And that I'm storytelling has uses. Yeah, I agree, that's true, Ben, as well. But this is what I love about this community. It's not it's the fact that it can challenge, it uses the maps, it shares with others, and hopefully those are some of the values which will stay with the community as the new leaders arise and us and I can go and hide in my cave where I like to be a hermit.
Excellent. Well, Simon, thank you for giving the gift to us that is mapping and letting us play with it, and inviting people like Kat and me into the space to play with you. And I'm excited for Map Camp this year. October 13th. Come join us. This is going to be a really fun year. Lots of spicy topics, lots of spicy speakers, interesting stuff. We're going to see a lot more maps, I think, too. And it's going to be a really fun time. So go to mapcamp.co.uk, get your tickets. Early bird tickets are running out now. And please reach out to us on Twitter. I've put everyone's handles in the description of this video. Say hello. Feel free to, pull us into Twitter threads and be like, hey, that thing that you said, I have questions about that. And, we love talking to you. So thank you for being here, and thank you for joining us. Kat and Simon, thank you also. I couldn't do this without you. I'm so grateful.
Can I just say thank you to you both as well? I mean, your heart and soul of this community, and you do amazing things. So it's wonderful. So thank you.
I wish I could hug you, Simon. It's been a long time since we had a good hug, but someday in the future, maybe. All right.
When my beard is smaller. Oh, terrible.
I love it.
I know, clean shaven.
Oh, well. All right. With that, I will say goodbye.